Today we have General Robert Spalding. General Robert Spading was a senior director at the National Security Council, and we're going to get into some of the controversy about that. We're going to be talking about 5G, the concerns that both General Spalding and myself have with regards to 5G. We're going to be talking a lot about China, and we're going to be talking about the future of a technocratic society and how we can preserve freedoms across the board with that. So first found out about you through Valuetainment interview with Patrick Bet-David, recently interviewed Patrick myself, and then read your book, Stealth War, on Audible, just finished that and found what you're doing very fascinating. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, it should be fun.
Okay, so let's start here. And you give me a hand wave when you give me an ear itch when we're getting close to time. Okay, so let's start here. So you're working as a senior director at the National Security Council. And first of all, before we get into the meeting that ultimately led to a very controversial firing, what the heck is the National Security Council to begin with? And what does it mean you're General Robert Spalding at the National Security Council? What the heck is that?
So the National Security Council is really the I guess what you would call the staff to the president for national security policy making. And so what they do is convene meetings with all the departments and agencies in the federal government to seek answers to policy questions that we have. What are we going to do about China? What are we going to do about the Middle East? What are we going to do about nuclear weapons? These are all purview of the National Security Council, and it's a great place to work as somebody that works in the executive branch. So whether you're in the State Department or the Commerce Department or the Treasury Department, or like myself in the Department of Defense, they have need for these people to come to the National Security Council and help them, essentially conduct and orchestrate this national security policy making process. So it's really about staffing the president for, how he comes up with his solutions to policy questions with regard to national security.
Okay, great. So tell me the accuracy of this statement here. You can rate it on a scale of 1% accurate, meaning totally off base, 100% accurate. Yes, this is exactly how it happened. So you were a senior director at the National Security Council. You are briefing essentially the rest of the National Security Department, President Trump and his staff. And in essence, what you were talking about is the greatest concern to the freedom of our democracy is not Al-Qaeda, and it's not Russia, and it's not X, Y, and Z. The biggest concern to the threat to our freedoms, in your view, was China and 5G, the militarization of 5G and all the aspects of 5G that we're going to get into. And you presented this to President Trump, the rest of his board, and I'm sure, I don't know all the extent of everyone that was there, and you were abruptly fired right after presenting this information. Is that accurate?
It's about, I would say, probably 35% accurate. There's a lot of things that, of course, my time at the National Security Council was almost the total of a year.
Okay.
So I worked there for quite a while, and I did was the chief architect for the national security strategy that is currently being conducted. After, we had roughly sketched out what that would look like, and most of that was really describing the threat that you pose about China to our national security and not really our democracy. I started a study on 5G. So while the kind of the final touches were being put on the national security strategy, at the same time, I was conducting this study. And so towards the end of that study, I briefed it to a lot of the cabinet secretaries. And then at the day before I left the National Security Council, the National Security Advisor. I did not brief President Trump, and I'm not not aware that he ever got the direct briefing that I was giving to the cabinet secretary.
So they shut you down before that. Okay, so give us a summary.
They did shut me down before that.
So give us a summary of what you're saying, the research you put into play and the things that you were discussing that got you shut down before this could even be presented to Trump's cabinet. Give us an idea of what these concerns are that you were discussing and the full extent to them, and we'll get more into 5G as we're going on, because I had never heard of 5G. And it seems like it was only, I don't know, what was it, 18 months ago, 24 months ago? All of a sudden, I just hear all this stuff about 5G. And I'm like, what the heck I don't even know what this is. I guess you can stream Netflix a little quicker. So give us an understanding of what the concerns that you presented were that ultimately led to your termination and the work that you were doing during that year at the National Security Council before you were terminated.
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that I was working on for the last 5 or 6 years, and it really culminated in that time at the National Security Council, was focused on what the Chinese were doing economically, financially, trade-wise, information, media, politics, academia, all of these things where they're involved in our institutions in the United States, and they're essentially, undermining them. And so that study on 5G was it was, first of all, to educate myself on what 5G was, because it was coming. I knew that. And I thought that we should understand about it, what the, I think the benefits and the opportunities, but also the challenges were. And really, at the time, nobody understood the technology within government. And so I brought in engineers engineers like from Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung, companies that build these networks for a living. So they make the equipment and then they essentially install this equipment on behalf of telecom operators around the world. And I brought them in to tell me about 5G. So one of the things that I learned during this time was that 5G, different than any other cellular communication beforehand, had really 3 frequency bands, which is something that 2G, 3G, 4G did not have. It has a low band, which is what a lot of 3 and 4G are operated on today. It has a mid band, which there's a little bit of 4G operating in. And then has a high band, there's absolutely nothing operating in. And the first thing that the engineers came to me and I said, look, if we were going to build a secure internet, because as I'll get to, and as I've spoken about before, it really wasn't about my concern about the technology per se. It was about the ability for the Chinese to influence our population through tools that had been developed in Silicon Valley, in companies like Facebook and Google, to influence people without their knowing. Being able to protect the population from that was so important. So we were talking about if we could take this new technology and deploy it widely within the United States securely to prevent the Chinese from being able to influence, or the Russians or anybody else, how would we do that? And the first thing they told me is that the frequency bands that Verizon and AT&T were planning to deploy 5G in could not be deployed economically or in any time frame less than like 20 years. So, and consequently,
in the United States.
In the United States. And consequently, if you looked at what the rest of the world was doing, Europe, Asia, China, South Korea. By the way, China and South Korea both have deployed 5G. South Korea throughout its entire country, China in 50 major cities last November. None of these countries were deploying it in millimeter wave or high band. That's what. So that was the biggest issue that I found, and what that means is that we have put ourselves into a problem with regard to policy, because if we're requiring that we deploy this network in high band, there's no way that we can deploy it anytime soon. That was the biggest problem. in terms of deploying the network in a time frame like I thought we needed to do, which was in 3 years. But the real challenge about 5G was not, the technology itself. It wasn't about the faster data speeds, the lower latency. It was about the risk of increasing the massive connectivity in our country without protecting the data that was flowing within the network. And this is really exposing how social media networks and e-commerce and fintech and all these big data analysis, artificial intelligence, all these technologies that are being developed in Silicon Valley and other places for our new e-economy work together to essentially influence you to be a better consumer in the case of the United States companies, or in China, influence you to adopt a political system and behave in a certain manner. So it was really about the power to control the population without them understanding it, and then building that capability within our country and giving that power to the Chinese. And that was the chief danger that I thought the only way to preserve our democracy was to build it in a way that didn't allow that to happen.
So are what you're saying then is 5G really gives the opportunity for the greatest known way to create psychological warfare, either to further agenda with companies that want to profit off of it, or to further the agenda for certain political or social means?
Right. And the way it does that, because of that increased connectivity, 10,000 devices per square mile for a 4G network, 3 million per square mile for a 5G network.
So you're saying per square mile on 4G, which is what our phones basically have right now. Repeat that one more time, because it's like, I don't know. Before I even found you, I didn't even know what 5G was, and I don't think most people really understand. So what the heck? So you're saying, rephrase that statement before you go on with the devices.
So like today, you have one smartphone, right? And if you ever go to a sporting event or a music concert and you notice that your phone stops working because you have, all these thousands of people around you and they're all trying to access the network, this is a limitation of 4G. 5G takes away that limitation. So this year I was at the Super Bowl, and the stadium was lit up by all of these bracelets that everybody had on that were all connected to the network, and were all operating in sync to create a light show that went along with the halftime show. That extra connectivity that allowed that to work seamlessly was because they had installed 5G transmitters and radios in the stadium. So 5G really allows you to attach all kinds of things that 4G doesn't allow you to. Things like cameras, like microphones, like self-driving cars, like street cleaners, like, automated trash collectors, all the things that you can think of from the Jetsons. If you ever watched that cartoon, it really is meant to automate the city around you. When you put that network in today, your smartphone tracks everything you do. It knows who you are. All the accelerometers, all of the ability to collect data about you, what you're saying, your facial features, if you have fingerprint, all of those things paint a picture of who you are. The phone knows who you are. And therefore, those that have access to the phone know who you are and know your patterns of life. But if you don't want to be tracked in a 4G world, don't have a smartphone. It's easy, right? Don't sign up for cloud services and don't have a smartphone. But in a 5G world, that architecture is built around you. People put up cameras. People put up microphones. All of these machines that are self-driving cars and everything, they get attached. They also have cameras. Seen the Tesla's self-driving car feature. It has a lot of cameras. It basically can monitor everything that's going on around the car. These are the things of 5G. It's really this machine-to-machine communication that's occurring that is also like your smartphone today is tracking you in the future. So when a 5G city gets completely built, when that 5G network is built, and then the things that are going to be attached to it are installed, the cameras, the microphones, the self-driving cars, and whatnot, now there's no way for you to opt out of that data collection. All of that data is being collected now about you. Everything that you do, every person you meet, every transaction you make is being collected on that network by all of these devices. And these devices, this data, then can be used to paint a very clear picture of who you are as a person, what motivates you, what are the things that you're concerned about, who are your friends, who do you rely on, what are your foibles, what are the things that the things that you do that maybe you don't want people to know. All of that gets picked up. And then because when you're looking to influence somebody, if you're a foreign country, all of that information is valuable. The Chinese essentially seek to collect that. And the way they do that is by dominating the patented technology for 5G and the standards by which under which the network is built. And how this happens is because industry drives how these standards are developed. And they do this in what's called industry standard making bodies. So for the telecom industry, it's called 3GPP. It's a organization made up of industries that voluntarily come together and propose to each other how the network should be built. And then they vote on it, and then when they vote on it, it becomes a release. So today we are on release 16 of 3GPP, which means release 16 of 3GPP is when people say 5G network, that's what they mean. This standard release of a 3GPP standard making body, which means that when you build this network, if you're Samsung, or if you're Huawei, or if you're ZTE, or if you're Nokia, if you're Ericsson, doesn't matter what company builds it. If you build this network, your network, your Ericsson network, is going to be compatible with a Huawei network because they're essentially built with the same standards and same technology, same patented technologies. What the Chinese realized after the United States had dominated the global information economy by dominating the smartphone platform and the 4G network, that they could do that by dominating 5G, the next iteration. So they could take over from the Silicon Valley companies that dominate the global economy today. So Amazon, Netflix, Google, Facebook, these are the companies that are dominant in the globe today economically. China seeks to displace those with companies like Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, because when they do that, rather than just being able to make you a better consumer, they can make you a better global citizen according to the way that they believe that you should behave.
Okay, so first of all, all of this is very alarming to me as someone I'm a very pro-liberty person, and this feels very 1984 to me. And so the 5G in general, no matter who controls it, is very concerning to me. So let's talk a little bit about, when you talk about basically the infrastructure of this being a mass psychological warfare, how are they an instrument of it? How is it used for that? Is it because there's frequency bandwidths that can affect brainwave state? Is it that they can flash certain things onto your phone? I mean, why is this such a concern? I know there's a lot of concerns about potential radiation aspects and health components, but from the things that we're talking about from psychological warfare and in a mass manipulation perspective or control of psyche, how does that actually work?
Yeah, it works much in the same way that, do you remember the Cambridge Analytica controversy surrounding the 2016 elections, where people's Facebook data? So you can basically build so I've got, 74,000 Twitter followers, right? You've got 600,000 followers on YouTube. You can use those followers to create an army, if you will, by targeting people that think and act relatively similarly. That's one of the things that these
collecting
platforms,
the data from the microphones, from the information the phone's picking up.
No, just from the fact that you target people that the data on the platform that's collected about the people that follow you in the social media, that can be then turned into understanding what kind of people follow you. And then you can use that to target other similar people using other platforms to bring them to your audience, right? So that's frequently used in advertising to grow an audience. So you're using the data collection on the platform, on the social media platform, to find like-minded individuals to bring them together. Now, people do that in politics today to get more support for their political party or more support for their candidate. Companies do that to get more support for their products, right? By understanding, finding like-minded people and bringing them together. You can also find like-minded people that want to protest the government. And so, in fact, if you look in the before the 2016 elections and after the 2016 elections, the Russians were doing this quite a lot. And the Russians do something that's called an influence atomization, and it's really about creating dissent or strife within a society, because they like to create chaos in countries because they feel it weakens their democracies, right? It weakens their bonds that bring them together as a society. And so they do this everywhere, and they were doing it before and after the 2016 election. They were inciting, Clinton supporters to hate Trump. They were inciting Trump supporters to hate Clinton. This is part of a pattern of behavior that the Russians have conducted for decades since the Cold War. Well, it's become so much easier now by using the same techniques that I just explained to you that advertiser uses, by using that data on social media. So big data analysis, and then sending messages to those people to bring them together. And so in the case of there's about 4 days after the election in New York City, there's a protest. It was instigated by supposedly a group on Facebook called Black Lives Matter. And it was about 15 to 20,000 people, and they marched in New York City and marched up to Trump Tower. Now, it was not a group in the United States called Black Lives Matter. It was the Russians using big data analysis, using Facebook in this case, a social media network, and using AI bots. So these bots that are meant to look like participants on the platform, but are in reality just designed to send messages that kind of stir up sentiment and then begin to coalesce these, what would usually be disparate groups, together. So say you have three groups that, kind of have similar interests or, have similar outlooks. You can begin to use that messaging to bring them together on an issue. And so that's what the Russians were using, these AI bots. So what they would do is find people like you that had a group of followers. Then they would begin to hijack your group and begin to pull it in a way that using these messages in a way that you did not intend. But then the ultimate goal was to create this protest in New York City, and they were successful. This is going on all over the world, and some of it's going on behalf of domestic politics. Some of it is going on behalf of companies that are doing marketing. Some of it is going on behalf of these countries like the Russians, like the Chinese, that are meant to, like Iran, that are meant to basically create dissent or to get people to adopt a point of view that they feel is important to them. Back in when China joined the WTO, there's a famous quote by Bill Clinton, and he said that controlling the internet is like nailing Jello to the wall. And he said that there's no way that the Chinese Communist Party could control the internet. Well, what they've discovered is that, you don't have to control the internet. It's really about controlling the use of the data. And if you can use that data in ways that allow you to imperceptibly influence people that are, connected to the internet, you can move from where we kind of think of today of cyber attacks, from attacking the computer to attacking a human brain, right? And so it's not about some, yes, you can attack a human brain with radiation, right? So with radio frequencies, but that usually causes damage to the brain. What we're talking about here is using ideas to begin to, to subtly influence the way you think. We know this to be the case. When you take somebody and you put them in isolation and you only give them one set of facts, then they tend to build their perception of the world around that set of facts. And it is extremely difficult for them to essentially deprogram themselves. We've seen that from people that have been, captive in isolation and basically, created this alternative view based on everything that they were taught during this time. This is what's going on in China currently. It's what's going on in North Korea and Iran. These authoritarian regimes where they have limited information from the outside. They're taught a certain thing. So this is how China seeks to export its brand of governance, which is really about keeping its own, the Communist Party in power.
So quick yes or no, that's why you're seeing China and Iran and South Korea being some of the first places to roll out 5G, because it helps further the political party's control over the population faster. Okay,
absolutely.
Understood. Why is it, knowing all this information, you sound more like an American hero rather than somebody that should be getting fired. Why is it giving this information you were fired? I don't understand.
So what you have to understand about DC is, their enormous corporate interests. So corporations, large companies in the United States hire lobbyists, and those lobbyists are meant to influence the political process to ensure that their prerogatives are met. In my case, what happened was, while I wasn't espousing nationalization of the network as was portrayed when my report was leaked to the media, that's what the telco industry wanted to have it portrayed as I was doing, because to them, they were concerned that there was going to be regulation that would force them to secure their networks, number one, and number two, to build a network, so there's two problems there. One is they don't want to secure their networks because they make money selling data about you. Number two, they don't want to build a 5G network because they're all broke. And that's because the business model is broken. Today, telco, when they add capacity to their network, they get diminishing financial returns. That's because Silicon Valley figured out that the value wasn't in the connection, your internet connection. The value was in your data, right? And so they've built these enormous platforms to monetize your data. If I understand everything about you, then I can do a better job of selling you advertisements. That's essentially what Silicon Valley built. Because the entire technology of the internet is based on an open data model, they could come over the top of the telcos. So the telco had a connection to you via your smartphone, but they didn't own or control that data that was flowing. So the platform of the smartphone became the way that these tech companies could get access to your data. And the telephone companies tried to stop that. First of all, they tried to control where you were able to go in terms of the internet on your smartphone. Then they tried to control what apps could be on your smartphone. Of course, all of that was prevented. And then eventually the tech companies began to monetize data. And the telephone companies that built the infrastructure could not repay those investments because all of the value in your data was taken up by the tech companies. And so today they're losing money on selling you connectivity, but they are making money on selling you products like, in the case of AT&T, that's why they bought Time Warner. They want to sell you the products of Time Warner, those movies and that programming. That's where they make their profit, because they don't make any profit really on the connectivity that they sell to you.
So are these companies actually building these platforms and these apps because they believe in the apps or the programs, or is it a very manipulative way in order to steal data, and that's the true business model behind the creation of these apps entirely?
It's not just the companies that have the platform, so Apple and Google. It's also it's every app creator. I mean, what you want to do is build a platform that brings users so that you can begin to collect their data. That's what you monetize.
So it really is a pure manipulation game in order to get data to make the money off of it.
Right.
Wow. That's and so you presented all this information basically, or you were in the process of presenting this information, and there were people that were threatened by this because of the profit that they would lose, and that's in essence why you were fired. Is that correct? Yes or no?
Yeah. So in essence, so if you think of the telecom industry, you have organizations within government that are responsible for following or working with or regulating those companies. A lot of those people in those positions in government have been, particularly if they're political appointees, have been recommended by that industry for those jobs, and so they have a close relationship with those companies. And so what happened was one of those government political appointees in the government, in one of those positions, on behalf of the telecom industry, leaked my report and presentation to the media, and with the statement, this is a stupid idea. We're getting rid of Spalding. That's what was told to the reporter. And then, today you can go and you can find my full report and my full presentation that I was giving to the cabinet secretaries and the National Security Advisor online. If you Google Axios 5G, there's an article about the Trump administration wanting to nationalize 5G. Again, that title for that article was proposed by the telecom industry, and it was meant to essentially discredit me and to discredit the report and deflect any attention to the challenges that 5G presented to the nation.
So this is a bipartisan issue in that on both sides, you don't discuss a lot of names, but some of the names that you do discuss is you've got Republican Mitch McConnell, and then of course you have the Biden family, specifically Hunter. So you have Democrat and Republican side that's deeply connected into China. Is that an accurate assessment that this was a bipartisan kick you out?
Well, I wouldn't call it, it wasn't from the political establishment, it was from the corporate sector.
Okay.
It was entirely from the business community that this occurred. And, I think this happens all the time. If you speak up about pharmaceuticals, if you speak energy industry, if you speak up about telecom, all of those, you can find yourself on the wrong side, and particularly as a government employee, and pressured by corporate interests to either be fired or moved off to another job.
So
this happens all the time.
Okay, yeah, understood. So let me ask you, what's more concerning to you, these types of companies or foreign government? Because it sounds like these companies are willing to destroy the Constitution and long-term freedoms of future generations purely for their own profit, which is, to me, it makes you, not you personally, but it makes these companies in Silicon Valley that are American companies, it makes them the enemy to me. Elaborate.
Yeah, well, I mean, to the extent that they control the platforms that are influencing, our population, I would say that. So there's three issues here. There's a technology issue, there's a business issue, and there's a policy issue. On the technology side, open data is really, I believe, a danger to democracy because it allows the aggregation of your data, the collection of your data, and then that which can lead to, through artificial intelligence, machine learning, and big data, an understanding of who you are as a person. So it's like putting your life on DVR. Remember the Truman Show? Okay, so I mean, that's basically what Silicon Valley is built today. So that's a danger to democracy because essentially it deprives you of your right to privacy. It deprives you, in a sense, in this country, of the right to unlawful search and seizure, right? If your information can basically be gathered without your consent, we're violating that part of the Constitution. So the open data model is a technology issue. It's because we haven't implemented encryption across the internet or across our networks to ensure that whatever data is collected about you is secured and you're the one that owns the key.
Because
right?
We have not. That's what you said. Because
we have not. We have an open data model, not a closed data model. So that's a technology problem. We have a business problem in that, today we can't build a 5G network in this country because the telecom companies are broke. And they're broke because, as I said, Silicon Valley came over the top, took the data out of the system, and therefore all the profits out of the system. So none of the telecoms have the money to build a 5G network. So if we wanted to build a secure 5G network to protect your data and to protect your privacy, we would need the companies to do it. They don't have the money. So technology problem, business problem, and we have a policy problem. And the policy problem is this. We sell spectrum. Spectrum is the frequency spectrum that's, that goes from very low frequency to very high frequency. We sell licenses for that spectrum here in the United States. So for a given geographic area, there are literally hundreds of different companies or agencies that own pieces of that spectrum in that area. And this is based on the fact that, this is how we were able to build out the telecom industries of the past by selling this spectrum. And because these companies own this spectrum outright, the use of it, they could then go and finance the build out of a network because they could show that because they could build this network, they would be able to sell you internet service. And so they could get financing from a bank to build it. So it's really based on that business model of selling spectrum. What's happened today, because 5G is such a big pipe, and what I mean by that, 4G network has a very narrow slice of spectrum, say 25 megahertz, that runs the network. And so that means you can only get so much data through that network. 5G blows it up to 500 megahertz. It's a huge pipe. It literally can carry, one network can carry all the traffic on all the networks that we have today. And really that's the most efficient way to build the network because you build one network and everybody shares it. AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile shares it. But the problem is the spectrum required, that frequency spectrum, is already being used by other companies or agencies. So Department of Defense, for example, the telecom companies, satellite companies, they all have a piece of the spectrum across the United States. And so what the FCC decided to do is go way up high. So in low frequency, it's like AM, FM radio. Very, very high frequency is like millimeter wave. Millimeter wave goes a very short distance. It won't travel through your body because water blocks it, clouds block it, leaves block it. This is a technology that's used when you go to the airport and you put your arms up and they scan.
I never do that, so right? I wouldn't know.
So what that does is basically use millimeter wave because it won't go through your body, but it will go through your clothes to show if you have anything, any kind of weapon underneath your clothes. So that's what the high band use that the FCC said that we were going to use. So that was the only spectrum they had to sell. Everything else had been sold. So rather than saying, hey, some of these companies have spectrum, they're not even using it. They're just basically sitting on it, waiting for, the next bidder to come by and give them several $1 billion for it. By the way, the American people own the spectrum. The FCC sells a license to use it. So no company owns the spectrum. They only own a license to utilize that. The real spectrum itself is owned by the American people. It's a common resource for all Americans. But because the way technology had developed over time, we had sold licenses to pieces of that spectrum. Think of like real estate, right? So you want to build a new mall, and you've got 20 houses that you've got to buy up in order to build that new wall or that new mall. And then you have 3 houses that refuse to sell their property, right? So now you can't build that new mall until you get rid of those 3 houses, but those 3 property owners aren't going to sell. That's what we have today in the United States in the spectrum area that we would need to have 5G built. So since there was no spectrum in the best area to build, we took this other area up in the very high band. It can't go a long distance, maybe 300 yards. It can't go through human bodies. So when the telecom companies go to build a network like this, you go from a network where you need, say, 90 antennas to a network where you need, in that same area, 1,200 antennas in order to make that network work. So if you think about that logically, when you're talking about that kind of density of antennas all around everywhere, you realize that, oh my gosh, this is going to take decades to build out an internet based on this high band frequency wave. And so we have a technology problem with open data. We have a business problem in that telcos are broke. And we have a policy problem in that the FCC hasn't really forced those what I call spectrum squatters to begin to dynamically use their spectrum. So today, the where we've gone with software-defined radios and software-defined networks is that rather than needing one piece of continuous spectrum, right? So in this case, we would say in that mall, you would need 5 houses side by side in order to tear down. Because of how software-defined radios and software-defined networks have evolved, you can take a house here, you can take a house here, and you can take a house over here, and then you can treat them like the houses were essentially built side by side using software. So now the strategy of the FCC, which was built on old technology, is not keeping pace with the technology of today, and that's our policy. So if you go to a country like China, what they did is they just said, we're going to take 200 megahertz of spectrum away from the current owners of that spectrum, and we're going to give it to the telcos, and we're going to say build out one network. You 2 telcos, you're going to cooperate, you're going to build one network, and you're going to share it. That's the way that the technology should be built. From a policy perspective. So if you look at from a policy perspective, that's how they attacked policy. From a business perspective, they said, okay, well, the telcos are broke. This doesn't make sense. Who's making money on this is Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, the tech companies. So we're just going to take the profit that they make, and we're going to give it to the telecom operators and the equipment manufacturers. So we're going to subsidize those businesses because we know that we want our data companies to be the most powerful. So we'll not only build networks in China, we'll build networks everywhere. Anybody that will allow us, we will subsidize that network. In fact, if you say that you don't have enough money to pay for the network, we'll build it for you for free because we want your data. So that's how they've dealt with the business problem. And then on the technology problem, they basically threw billions of dollars at Huawei and ZTE and used the intelligence collection apparatus of China to steal all the technology they needed. So they either bought or acquired or stole the technology they needed. Plus, they threw billions of dollars to develop the technology. So now, unlike everywhere else where the telecom industry and the equipment manufacturers are basically going out of business because Huawei and other companies are being subsidized in their markets, now they have a strong technology foundation. Now they have a solid business model, and they have the right policy aligned to make these things work within China. And other countries are essentially following suit. So today in the world, if you're deploying 5G networks, you're deploying them because China's building the network for you.
So you hit the nail on the head of one of my concerns about a communist country like that. Now, they do the same subsidies for big pharma that allows them to pump fentanyl into America, and they do the same thing with gold mines. Now, one of the things that I'm very into is financial system and the concerns. China knows it can't beat us in a straight up military war. So they're doing all of these things, data collection, and we have no idea how much gold they have. And they're building a gold hoard, and they're working on cryptocurrencies to eventually get in a position to work with these other sanctioned countries such as Russia, Iran, in order to eventually destabilize the United States dollars. Now, you're talking about how
have you read Lords of Finance?
I haven't read that book, no.
I would definitely recommend reading Lords of Finance. It talks about the head of the central bank of Germany, of France, of the UK, and the US prior to the aftermath of the First World War and kind of the Great Depression. But one of the things that they talk about during the approach to World War I was the fact that Germany was hoarding gold because of the fact that all of these financial systems have become inflated. Very interesting.
Yeah, I wrote that down. I'm really into Nomi Prins and James Rickards, who discuss, it sounds like a similar type of topic. James Rickards used to work for the Central Intelligence Agency to teach them about the financial war China and Russia were playing on America. So let's go back here. So you said that China's subsidizing these companies, right? Which allows them to, even if they would be bankrupt in a normal kind of free market society, because we're seeing now an economic system, we don't exactly have the level of free market that we thought we did, but we're seeing China subsidize these countries. So how do we, and we're seeing a lot of Europe rolling out these 5G. People used to make jokes about China's going to take over the world. Ha ha ha. It's happening. What do we do about that? Because they're clearly rolling this out and we aren't even prepared to fight against that. And there's a high probability that not a high probability. There is a probability that the next person in office will actually be someone whose family has taken hundreds, if not millions, if not billions. We have no idea how much money they've taken from China. And it seems like this agenda is being pushed.
Yeah. So what happens is, in the U.S., because we believe that as China grew wealthy, they would democratize, we have instituted a number of policies that benefit their companies. One of the policies is that they're companies that register their stocks. So the companies that are going to buy stocks through American depository receipts coming out of Hong Kong are not required to meet the same audit and transparency requirements of U.S. companies. So no Chinese company is required to be Sarbanes-Oxley compliant, right? So what that means is they can sell you stocks and you have no idea what's behind what you are buying, okay? So that's one of the ways that they get money from the U.S. And they go right to institutional investors. And so the United States today, as a country, has 40% of the investable capital in the entire world.
Okay.
All right. So it's a huge, and capital is what drives economic growth. Without capital, for investment, you can't grow economically. And China knows this. And so they use this ability to raise money for their companies, but that money doesn't necessarily have to stay with those companies. It can be used for anything that the Chinese Communist Party wants, because as soon as it hits the People's Bank of China, it's their money. So it's not Alibaba's money, it's not Baidu's money, it's not Tencent's money. It is the Chinese Communist Party's money, and they can use that money any way they want. And because they're not Sarbanes-Oxley compliant, we have no idea what's going on behind that curtain. The problem is that our investment banks, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, that sell equities and bonds to the institutional investors like the California Public Employee Retirement System, CalPERS, right? They get a fee for those sales. So they're incentivized by the Chinese Communist Party to continue to lobby the federal government to continue to allow Chinese stocks and bonds to be sold into U.S. retirement systems in spite of the fact that they're not audited.
Yikes.
That's a huge, huge problem in our system, and it results in, literally over $1 trillion of our money going over to China.
Is this? I mean, it almost feels like I'm listening to you, and it's just literally this is powerless. I mean, you've been kicked out of your position, and I highly doubt you're allowed to make the rounds on mainstream media to discuss this type of stuff. I mean, it sounds like, I guess I feel kind of like we're powerless to an eventual takeover of China to take over the world, basically.
Well, I mean, that's why, I say in my book that the Chinese are so afraid of the Constitution because, look, President Trump, whether you like him or hate him, he is not from the political establishment. He is completely outside of that. And so he's kind of free from, in some respects, from those bonds, but in other respects, not. And it's really about, your choice as a voter, how you scrutinize the relationships of people that you elect to the apparatus that I'm describing. It is a very powerful apparatus, and it influences our political process. And so I do think that, if we have a chance to change things, but people have to be informed, just like you're doing now. They have to understand what's going on, and they have to recognize that, if you're going to get elected by the Republican or the Democratic Party, in most cases, you have to adopt that platform, or you will not get donations by the big donors in order to essentially promote your campaign, right? So it's almost you have to adopt their platform lock, stock, and barrel. So in a lot of ways, our system, because of the way it's operated, it's taken thinking out of and independent politicians out of the process. You're entirely captive either of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, and those independents that are out there can't gain enough, of a power base within Congress, whether in the House or the Senate, to actually affect any considerable change. Part of the problem, I believe, is term limits, but the other problem is just the amount of corporate money, which is also, by the way, influenced by Chinese money that gets poured into the political process. All of this is stuff that I think Americans need to understand and recognize and thoughtfully, I think activate against or be active against, because otherwise our democracy is going to fail. We are headed on a path of continued, and we saw this, by the way, very clearly during the coronavirus, where people now are being arrested for essentially gathering in public places, and their civil rights are being trampled on the basis of the coronavirus. And this is going on across our country.
It's very concerning to me. what we've discussed so far and what you said as well about civil rights being destroyed, and not just civil rights, what's going to happen when, they just said that they just announced another 3.4 million people this last week filed for unemployment. What's going to happen when we hit 50 million people are unemployed, and they say in the fall another round of coronavirus is coming back, and all of a sudden it moves to 70 million people don't have a job? What happens at that point? Then it rolls into something I heard Robert F. Kennedy talk about, which I know you know who Robert F. Kennedy is, but for people that aren't familiar, we're talking about the nephew of John F. Kennedy and the son of Bobby Kennedy, both of whom were assassinated. So Robert F. Kennedy talks about, and he discusses it at length in his books. He discussed it at length in his Entertainment with Bet David. He talks about the dangers of what occurs with the rollout of 5G when it's used for authoritarian purposes, and how this ties into what happens when people don't have jobs and everything's being monitored. And that if basically he paints a very bleak picture that I'm sure you've heard discussed, or maybe you've thought about yourself, in that there's ultimately becomes a situation where the population has the potential to be so controlled that everything's pulled back to a central grid that controls your digital currency. And if you don't do what happens, it can be removed, and everything's tracked through these 5G things. And that's very concerning to me.
That's exactly what China's doing, by the way. That's the social credit score.
And what the social credit score, first of all, let's elaborate on what that is, because then it concerns me as an American, because then I say, okay, so technically, you or I, if cash was banned and they said, okay, well, germs are very bad, and so you can't use cash anymore because you're going to spread the coronavirus, so cash is illegal, turn it in, and we have our digital wallet. So your digital wallet is connected to a microchip or an iPhone or what have you. That stores all of your information, and you and I are talking about these things saying, no, we don't like this. All of a sudden, you and I are dinged on our credit score. So what does that mean? We get money pulled out of our account? Can we get an account freeze on our money? What do you have to say about that?
So that's what's going on in China right now. So you get banned from getting on public transportation. You can't get on an airline. If you're a dog owner and your credit score drops so much, your dog gets taken away. These are the types of things that how they begin to shape the behavior of the population through the social credit score, because they're monitoring everything that you do, and because as you note, your ability to move around the city or move around your community is entirely controlled by the fact that you need certain things, money being one of them, but also access to transportation or services being another, or, in the case of your kids, education, in your case, a job to earn an income. All of those things, the government can basically influence your life on. So, that's the bottom line.
Is China gonna be going through my information after I publish an interview with General Robert Spading?
I'm sure that they will definitely pay you a visit, an electronic visit.
So, okay, now let's talk about the
And I apologize, but I'm gonna have to go.
Okay, dang! I wanted to ask you about the NBA. Give me a yes or no right now. I'm an NBA fan. LeBron James paints himself as this incredible activist. I'm more than an athlete, and then basically is insinuating he wants Daryl Morey fired for talking about freeing Hong Kong. Very concerning to me as someone. Let's say someone's listening to this that has money at stake in China, and they say, look, there's money at stake here. I want to make the money. Make me a final pitch here in conclusion on freedoms versus money and accepting money from an authoritarian dictatorship and the path that we're headed on versus standing for freedom. If LeBron James is listening to this right now, or another professional athlete, or a major Silicon executive that's making a bunch of money off of this.
Well, yeah, I'll give you two. I'll give you LeBron James. I'll give you Tim Cook. So LeBron James, you're right. What he said about Daryl Morey today, he's complaining about a black man that was killed in Georgia, and he's rightful. He's rightful to complain about that because it's a tragedy, because the guy was basically jogging and these guys just went up and basically hijacked him and killed him, and it's a terrible tragedy. But he complains about that, while in the same breath, back then with Daryl Morey, he's not highlighting the fact that the Chinese people are being, they have forced organ harvesting, or you have concentration camps. You get the highest, execution rate in the world. All of these terrible, terrible things. I mean, that the Chinese Communist Party perpetrates on the Chinese people. And here, because he's making so much money as part of the NBA and their association with the Chinese Communist Party, that he's unwilling to actually call out the fact that, they're destroying the independent democracy of Hong Kong. So this is, it's basically inconsistent behavior with regard to him. And then for Tim Cook's aspect, Apple portrays itself as a very environmentally and socially conscious company, but it manufactures in China, a place where you have the Foxconn plants where their employees work have nets around them because of all the suicides that were happening because of the working conditions. And then if you live in China, the air, the land, the water has all been polluted because of these manufacturing processes. And essentially, Apple has made $260 billion in cash by having this alliance with the Chinese Communist Party. So it happens in sports, it happens in the corporate sector, it happens all over the United States. And I think that's the main tragedy of this, is that, people are willing to look the other way to some of the most horrendous things that are done to humans in the name of money.
So what you're saying in conclusion here, and I know you have to go, is LeBron James should probably Google what an ECMO machine is, which is basically when you dissent enough against the Chinese Communist Party, they remove your organs and they burn your body at a certain point if you disagree. And he's looking away from this because there's more money. And you're suggesting perhaps Tim Cook, LeBron James, and many other individuals perhaps read the United States Constitution.
Yeah, just be consistent. If you're going to be socially conscious, be consistent. The Chinese Communist Party is one of the worst social violators in the history of the world.
Thank you so much for your time. I truly appreciate it.